Det är nämligen så att nu har jag då äran att presentera mannen med kristallkulan. Så vi verkligen ska få se in i framtiden. Vi kommer att träffa Martin Kruse. Och Martin jobbar på Copenhagen Institute of Future Studies. Och en sak jag hittade när jag liksom bara försökte kolla upp, vem är det här? Så hittade jag hans examensarbete från 2003 som heter Herman Kahn and the Future Studies. The Realism in Fictionalized Scenarios in Future Studies. Så någon slags länk mellan fiktion och realism och framtidsstudier. Vem är denna Herman Kahn, blir man nyfiken på?
Herman Kahn är en militär strategi. I'll do this in English. My potato syndrome is a bit stronger than Martin's, so I think this is easier for most of you. Herman Kahn is a military strategist who redefined the U.S. military, and for those, he's kind of the guy who invented the modern future studies. And for those of you who might think that future studies is a weird stuff and you shouldn't do that, well, he was proven right during the Cuban crisis. So most of you might not be sitting here if they hadn't redesigned the entire nuclear arsenal because of this guy. So he's a pretty important guy, and I am very fascinated by him. I'll be talking about the future of skills and the nature of work going forward. But you introduced me as the guy with the crystal ball. I think one thing people have a tendency to think is that future studies or foresight is about predicting the future, which isn't really correct. What Herman Kahn did was acknowledge the fact that long-term planning had issues. See, if we were to predict the future, there wouldn't be an S in futures, right? It would be singular. But future studies is about possibilities. It's about uncertainties. So it's a constructive way of working with possibilities, future possibilities, and acknowledging that we cannot predict the future. See, most people think that future studies is about that. It's not. If you think you can predict the future, you'll be a lousy futurist. So it's working with uncertainties and creating strategies based on that. So that's what we do. The Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies, those who don't know us, is a think tank which was set up in Copenhagen some almost 50 years ago. So those of you who are new to foresight, it's been pretty popular within the last 5 years. It's actually pretty old. It was developed by Herman Kahn back in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and we were set up in the 70s. So we've been working with this in the beginning primarily for Danish organizations, but today most of our clients are international. It's worldwide global companies. We are a private, independent think tank, so we're not associated with the left wing or the right wing. I would like to kick this off with a quote from a guy which I admire in many aspects, Bill Gates. He says, or he can use to introduce kind of one of the concepts that is wreaking havoc for people today, the fourth industrial revolution and the consequences for jobs in the future. He says software substitution, whether it is for drivers or waiters or nurses, it's progressing. And 20 years from now, labor demand for lots of skills will be substantially lower, And I don't think that people have that in their mental models. And I agree. I don't think people acknowledge the rate of change and the impact, because it is hard to do that. Drivers is the biggest employer. Most people in the US are drivers or they are waiters. These are some of the areas that will be automated. So this will have a huge impact on us. But if we're looking at it from a global perspective, if you say that your job consists of 10 skills, some 30% of those skills will be automated. For some jobs, that will be 90%. For some, it's 5%. But we need to realize that when we talk about that, most of us consider that to be a threat. And for some, it is. But if we look at the past, and what we've seen happen in the past, this is jobs, jobs that existed. This is an old school refrigerator. And that's an old school alarm clock, right? That was jobs that were automated. We don't even consider that to be automated today. It's a thing, but it's not a thing. It was a job once. So certain things that we are doing today that people are employed with will seem ludicrous moving forward, because we can employ people in much better ways. That doesn't mean that it won't have impacts on employment. It will. I think one of the crucial aspects here is to consider the pace of change. And if we take a quote from Jack Welch, I think it's important to realize that if the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. Now that goes for private companies, but in certain aspects, it also goes for individuals. If you're stuck, mentally stuck, skills-wise stuck, and you don't change, you will have a problem going forward. What we are realizing to a great extent is that we need to foster some sort of resilience as individuals, but also as organizations. The world is increasingly complex, volatile, ambiguous, and we need to have certain frameworks to help us. And that means organizations need to foster resilience. They need to be prepared for the future planning. It needs to have some sort of detection mechanism in order to find out what to look for, needs to monitor. And it also needs to be proactive in terms of defining where to go. Martin was talking about that earlier, that us, country, Scandinavia, we have the possibility to be proactive and define our future, instead of just being reactive and let Google and whoever decide for us. So as organizations, but also as individuals, we need to foster that kind of resilience. I have a daughter and a son. And from a personal standpoint, my daughter is a straight A student. And my son isn't. But he has another quality. He is more laid back. And I think in moving forward, I think that quality, if I can merge those qualities into one, I think that would be a really good skill set going forward. Kind of being laid back, being resilient, but having the competences as well. Because we will probably see a more stressed environment moving forward. A goldfish doesn't need to be resilient, basically because its environment doesn't change. It stays in the same bowl, so it doesn't need that quality, that competence that we do. But we do, and it's hard for us. It's hard for us as individuals, but it is also hard for us as organizations. Because we're not used to having to work in environments that are so volatile, so complex. We don't have the right toolbox. We are more inclined to think in terms of the short term than the long term. We don't have the right incentive structures. And basically, there's a huge bias in most organizations. We tend to hope. We wait and see, well, maybe development passes us. Maybe it won't hit us. But for organizations, we need to align that kind of the culture of the organization. We need to align that with our task at hand. And for most companies, most organizations, if you ask them, if you were to redesign your organization, if you could do the whole thing over again, would you have the same organizational structure as you have today? Would you have the same culture? And most people say no. Why? Because our culture is a question of history. It's something which is embedded. It is built layer upon layer upon layer. So in cultures, we have all these hopes and aspirations, and they kind of define the company. So that means that organizational structures are much more inclined to be not fit for purpose and a product of those hopes, dreams, aspirations, cultures, and whatnot. We need more flexibility in those organizational structures in order to solve those tasks going forward. This is also a question of how we are as people, as individual persons. We've been doing studies for many years now on the perception of change among Danes. And one thing which is interesting is that people don't look at change the same way. Basically, you can say there's the people who think that the good old days are the best. And there's the people who are like, seeing is believing. I see it, okay, then I move. And then there are forward-looking people. That kind of difference in attitude towards change is interesting, because when we were working with an industrial company, and you had human resources, you had management, having this kind of perception, future-oriented. They thought of the future as something which was positive, good, something that they could influence. But when they spoke to the people on the ground, everything they said, everything that they realized as something positive was something that people on the ground said, no, we don't like that. Bad, that's bad. So they were totally disconnected to the people. Basically because their frame of mind, how they were as people, were totally different. So in order to manage that kind of, or manage any kind of change, we need to acknowledge that people are different and they perceive change in different ways. If we take a look at the skill sets that we need going forward, we have, of course, we are moving into a world where there's a lot more automation. There's a lot of skills that are being automated. So we need people who have technical understanding, of course, but we also need people who have some sort of understanding of the impacts on culture of those technologies. And instead of having learning, going to school and learning something that you'll use for the rest of your life, You need to have just-in-time learning. Learning all the way through, much more like courses. Because today, even if you're a doctor, if you are in a school today, then that knowledge that you have will be outdated almost by the time that you're out of school. So we are moving at a rate where we need to redefine how we make people adapt to that change. That means lifelong learning. We need to be transdisciplinary, and when tasks which are routine tasks, when they move out the system, we need a high degree of creativity. Now, people have problems with realizing the difference between computers and people. If you look at I was doing a project with Europol for some 3 years, and one of the issues was we were building this surveillance system and blah blah blah, but we were looking at how computers could intercept crimes, and this is a 3D printed gun, and this is a 3D printed airplane. You know, I, as a person, it's pretty easy for me to say, well, if you can print an airplane, you might be able to print a gun. A computer cannot do that. It cannot make the same kind of inference that we can. So while it can take routine jobs, automate it, put it aside, it cannot do that kind of job which is really interesting for people. And that's a good thing. But this is some creative people, which this is John Nash in the middle, or someone playing John Nash, the mathematician. These are highly creative, and we need creativity moving forward. But people have a tendency to think that creativity is equal with artistry, arts. It's not. Artists are no more creative than anyone else. Actually, the most creative people are physicists. They need to wreck their minds in order to perceive multiple universes. So we need to redefine how we consider what is creative. Creative person basically has, on one hand, motivation, and the other hand, they have domain knowledge, vast domain knowledge from different spheres. That is the basic concept of creativity. But there's also another one, which is that creative people tend to have, real creative people, tend to have higher divorce rates, tend to become more alcoholics. They are difficult to work with. So if we are pushing towards a society where creativity is more valued, we also need an organizational structure, a culture where we can open up to people who are different. Because creative people are different. If we look at all this information coming in, all this data, this technology, it means that we can do a whole new kind of management. And we've seen some of it. New public management, but this is kind of new public management 2.0. We can use people analytics and create a better work environment. But as we have seen with new public management, it is also sometimes a problem, because people are reduced to numbers and time slots, and they are not people. People that we respect to have their own, that they can manage their own time to the best of their ability and for the purpose, for the task at hand. So while this new management or this data comes in, and this can really provide us with a lot of things. There's been some studies done where it shows that people are wasting too much time in meetings where they should be out working with collaborating with others. It can show if there's an execution problem in real time. There's also been some studies showing that it really works in terms of where you should recruit talent from. Is it from one university or from another, or is it inside the organization? But I think it is crucial to understand that this is going to be a key challenge for us going forward, because we have already seen that with new public management, is that when we get data, we have a tendency to receive that as fact. And what we don't realize is that we don't have the context, and people live in context. So especially in terms of how we manage people, this is going to be a key challenge going forward. Who needs trust? Right here, when you've got data. The problem is that if we look at employee engagement, trust, and the care of people's needs and the nature of the job, to what extent people are involved, is what you destroy. And as I just said, motivation is the key for creative people. People need to be engaged. So if you get numbers, data, and you totally wreck that motivation, you'll destroy the creative climate. So that's going to be a key issue for us going forward. How do we do that in a way where we acknowledge that people are more than algorithms? Here, if you want to destroy the creative climate, it is time pressure, fear, internal competition, and those are precisely the things that you might expect would increase when you all get all these kind of data. You can track people. You can show how often they're at the coffee machine. You can show just about anything, but you don't get necessarily the context. The fact that at the coffee machine, they are talking to someone else, and they're getting a good idea. So this is a tool that is a blessing in disguise, because it is only when it's managed properly that will actually create the value that we are looking for. For public institutions, this public sector, what we know here is that in terms of creative organizations, we need freedom and risk appetite. Now, that's not something that public sector is known to have a bunch of. This is a bureaucracy. There's a clear hierarchy, the centralized decision-making. There is no desire for risk because it's a safety culture. So if we are to move towards a society where routine jobs are brought out, and we are moving towards a more creative society where jobs will be different, then of course that will also have an impact on the organization of public sector. I think one of the changes will be that we are here now, need to do things right in the public sector, where this is a structure of hierarchy, of control, a safety culture, a do it right culture, and up here you've got Silicon Valley kind of institutions. So if we are to change that, if some of the jobs are removed from public sector, some of the routine tasks are removed, then it opens up for a whole new way of working together. And that will probably move skills towards a more kind of Silicon Valley collaborative approach, which will redefine the public sector. Martin was talking about social experimentation. That is probably up here, where the public sector increasingly will experiment with new ways of doing things. Because just making sure that things are done right, that can be automated. But you will need to change a lot of things in public sector, like the not invented here syndrome, which is one of the key issues. Everyone wants to build something, within the own organization, instead of just working with partners on the outside. And if we are to move towards a public sector which are looking at input, or instead of input looking at output, that means that if there's some guy working in a silo over here, and there's another woman working in a silo over here, and they know that the competence is over here, and they can't bring that match together, that's not functioning. And that's kind of the way it is today. But increasingly, that person will have the ability to work with others and be sourced in and out, because money and salary and time it follows the person. So that will, of course, have a profound effect on efficiency, but it will also redefine how public sector is done. And it will probably take a long time, because culture will also kick in. But this is a move which I think public sector is one of the areas that's going to be mostly affected by automation, because a lot of these things can't be changed. Not the warm hands, but the administrative side of it will be changed. So to sum up, skills, I think, will change in the sense that they're not just a skill set, a functional skill set, but it is a frame of mind. It is to be resilient. It is very much about a personal trait, which is difficult, because it's difficult to learn. And organizations need to change as well. They need to change the framework, how they source people into different tasks, so they're not as rigid and working in the same kind of hierarchy. And we need to acknowledge that change is happening, and we need to acknowledge that uncertainty is out there and work with that kind of uncertainty. So to sum up, change is coming, and don't be the goldfish.